Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We're going to do a video that's kind of a follow-up to the Stormtrooper song we did yesterday by Sabaton. Obviously, the Sabaton history for it isn't out yet, so instead, we're going to do the Great War series, essentially their episode over Stormtroopers. So we're going to get into that in a second with Indy. The last part of the Great Northern War series should be out later on this afternoon, so be on the lookout for that. Also, if you want to join the Discord, I'll put the link down in the description below, and you can continue these conversations with us over there. With all that being said, let's get into it. German Special Forces of World War I, the Stormtrooper.
1916. The stalemate in the trenches of the Western Front continues, both sides desperate to come up with new strategies and tactics to break sophisticated enemy defenses. As the year came to a close, neither side could any longer afford to send wave after wave of men out against machine guns and artillery. But what would they do instead? The British and French would secretly develop tanks, but the German High Command would improve the quality and effectiveness of its infantry. They created Stormtroops.
And you see it continuously throughout the war, right? This back and forth of new ideas, new tactics, even new fronts in places like Gallipoli. Just try to do anything that you can to break the stalemate that, is grounding all of the belligerents, to the nub. And you see it with things like gas warfare, right? There's technology is going kind of so quickly that everybody's trying to see kind of what will work and what won't. And interestingly, coming into the war, the assumption was it was just another war, right? Like there were guns that were different, there were new technologies, but that would just, kind of it would basically like help all of the sides in the same sort of warfare that they were used to. And obviously what all sides found out very quickly was that it was an entirely different type of warfare, that the technological advancements that had been made essentially just made it to where the old style of warfare and tactics and all of that were obsolete. Bayonet charges, that was something that, especially the French, that was their whole mindset, was like bayonet charges, break the line, roll it up, and then the war will be over and the enemy will be on the run. Well, how many bayonet charges do you make? How many huge offensives do you have that just get mowed down by machine gun fire before you realize, okay, we need to take a step back and kind of reevaluate what we're doing here? And all the way almost to the end of the war, the safe thing to do was just to be on the defensive. Now, none of the sides were okay with that, just staying on the defensive. But when you study it in hindsight, you can see that sides that were on the defensive didn't lose as many men, did better overall for whatever the time period was, and the sides that were having the big offensives, they lost so many men that it's, you have battles that are nicknamed things like the Massacre of the Innocents and things like that. Just brutal warfare.
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about trench warfare and German stormtroops. Now, we did one special about trench warfare already, where I talked about various close combat raiding groups and assault patrols engaged in trench combat. But you could really see that the mass slaughter at Verdun began to change overall infantry tactics to a certain extent for the French, but on a large scale for the Germans. French Army Captain André Lafargue was one of the first who wrote about the realities of trench warfare and how small, concentrated troop formations would need to operate independently as opposed to under rigid directives from high command. While the Allies mostly ignored his writing, German High Command used captured texts of his pamphlets and combined his ideas with their own experiences of infiltration tactics. The Kalsow Assault Detachment was the first experimental Sturm Battalion, deployed on the Western Front in March 1916, and it consisted of a headquarter element, 2 pioneer companies equipped with body armor, specialized shields, and steel helmets, and a rifle company as support, equipped with a 37mm gun. It was really too soon to see any success or to even use the new weapon as intended, but the general idea was beginning to form. The real birthplace of the Stormtroops was in the East. The terrifying new tactics used by the Russians in the breakthrough of the Brusilov offensive, sudden but massive and accurate artillery strikes, quickly followed by concentrated shock troop detachments, were soon to be adapted and improved by the German captains Willy Rohr and Bernhard Redemann.
Yeah, so the use of artillery is something that everybody's kind of trying to figure out. How is the best way to use it? Because you see, just these huge opening barrages. I mean, you think they're big at the start of the war, and then every major battle, it's infinitely bigger than the last one. But then you start to see, okay, well, we're obviously not killing everybody with these barrages, and we can't just send a huge offensive after a barrage hits because they'll still get mowed down. So what do? Then you start to see new tactics, things like a creeping barrage, right? Where the barrage is basically disguising the offensive foot soldiers' movements as they get closer and closer to the enemy line. Then you see things like very specific gunfire or artillery fire that is supposed to hit one area to break that specific area or to get it, kind of into chaos. And then you send shock troops in right after it. The Brusilov offensive on the Eastern Front, if it wasn't the most successful offensive the Russians had, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. If it wasn't the most successful offensive that they had, it was certainly one of the most successful. The Russians they had a really rough go in World War I, and the Brusilov offensive was surprisingly, I think to everybody involved, way more successful, at least initially, than they expected it to be.
Now, the Sturmabteilung Rohr was already known for their shock troop tactics in the retaking of the Hartmannsweiler Kopf in 1915, and as part of the Fifth Army at the Battle of Verdun. Together with Redemann, they developed new doctrines of small unit tactics. They saw insufficient weapons training and the lack of coordination between the units as the major problems. The new shock troops would be quick and mobile while being flexible in their approach of a situation. Precise operational timing was the key for maximum effectiveness. They chose 2 specific types of German infantry to build the core of the Stormtroops. First, the Jäger Corps. The Jäger were light infantry, traditionally specializing in woodland or wilderness combat and operating in smaller units. Their skill in light infantry tactics like sharpshooting and their decentralized leadership made them an ideal choice for stormtroop detachments. Second, the Pioneer Corps. Like the Jäger, the Pioneers were experts in small unit operations under low-level command structures. Their expertise lay in erecting or breaching obstacles and in the art of grenade throwing. This made them very good for storming enemy defensive positions. In addition to their weapon and attack training, they studied how the enemy reacted to their assaults and moved through the trenches, and how to prevent resistance from forming. The new stormtroop tactics of Rohr and Redemann maximized their training to deadly effectiveness. The new battalions had very strict requirements. Soldiers could not be over 25 years old, had to be mentally and physically tough, single, athletic, and also had to have one other characteristic. They had to be aggressive. This was the key factor in the new doctrine. It was vital that the storm would always take the initiative from the enemy. The new tactics also changed something else, which is often overlooked: They brought about a revolution within German military culture against the old style of Prussian leadership, which held to strict rules in the chain of command. Orders came from high up, and junior officers coordinated with their superiors. But for stormtroops to be effective, this had to change, and junior leaders had to be allowed to make their own decisions. Stormtroops went hand in hand with decentralized leadership. Führe nach Direktive, leading through direct command, and Auftragstaktik, mission tactics, all without coordinating with high command, all revolutionary thoughts.
Yeah, the U.S. still does this. I'm not sure about what other countries, but the U.S. still uses decentralized command and objectives and all sorts of stuff like that. And I mean, you see the benefits of it, right? In a modern war, it's extremely difficult to have everything go the way that it was planned beforehand, right? And so once, the battle plan never survives first contact with the enemy, that really is the case. And so when things change, if you're having to get a command from the top and pass it all the way down, it's not fast enough, it's not coordinated enough. You need those troops to be able to get directives immediately when the situation changes. And like Indy said, it's so counter to military thinking prior to this that I'm sure some people just hated it. I'm sure that there were like conservative, old school military leaders that just despised this thought process.
Stormtroops became the new elite in the German army, hand-picked soldiers who lived and trained in exclusive companies and enjoyed better rations and more time away from the front lines than regular troops. On the other hand, their missions were extremely dangerous and the casualty rate was extremely high. General Erich Ludendorff encouraged their deployment in all German divisions, and they continued to evolve. Soon they would have flamethrower, trench mortar, and grenadier detachments, and General Oskar von Hutier would give his name to Hutier infiltration tactics, which combined surprise artillery bombardments with lightning encirclement movements. Like regular trench raiders, stormtroops were not tasked with capturing and holding trench lines. They were lightly equipped but armed to the teeth, with loads of ammunition and hand grenades. In general, they preferred the shortened Mauser M98 carbine, the 98K. Rapid fire.
Yeah, did y'all see that bag that he had? So the stormtroopers had these huge grenade bags that some of them would carry that just had loads of grenades in it. I talked about this in the Sabaton song, but they have all sorts of weapons depending on the division and where they are and all that, but all sorts of weapons that a normal soldier would not have, right? Things that are meant for shock. And somebody mentioned this, I think it was Melkor mentioned this on the Discord yesterday. It's essentially World War I's version of German Blitzkrieg, right? That's the kind of the idea and philosophy behind it. And they have these, like I said, brass knuckles, blunt instruments, like you would think of like a baseball bat. I don't think but that sort of stuff, right? And then they had light artillery, tons of grenades. Like they were quick and devastating. And in my opinion, they look pretty awesome.
Pistols like the Mauser C96, Danish Madsen light machine guns, and the MP-18 submachine gun. Special grenadier squads would carry bags full of hand grenades, while others operated the flamethrower, the rifle grenade, and small mortars. They were trained to use all arms in combination with each other. They also studied the enemy's weaponry to be able to take it and use it against him. A standard attack was to approach the enemy unseen, perhaps at night or in fog, cut the barbed wire, and wait for a sudden, violent, and accurate artillery barrage. In the confusion of the barrage, they emerged from cover and assaulted key points of the enemy defenses. But rather than occupy the trench lines or engage the enemy en masse, They pushed through the trench system, circling and confusing the enemy, and decimating the enemy flanks and the moving exposed reinforcements. The regular German infantry would then head into the trenches and destroy the defense lines. By the end of 1916, over 30 divisions had experimented with, trained, and finally integrated special battalions of assault troops into their forces. From the Vosges to the Romanian front, at Cambrai and Caporetto, the efficiency of the new German elite forces was astonishing. The final hours of the offensive German war machine were perhaps the Stormtroops' finest. The Kaiserschlacht, the German spring offensive of 1918, had great initial success because the Stormtroops broke through the Allied defenses along the entire line. The Stormtroop doctrine, of course, survived the war. The paramilitary Freikorps used the martial imagery of the Stormtroops, and Adolf Hitler created the SA, the Sturmabteilung. But really, many of the small unit tactics pioneered in the Great War are still taught today all over the world. Erwin Rommel's infantry attacks is even taught at officers' academies in the United States.
Yep.
And what did it mean to the enemy on the ground? Well, here's what Rommel himself had to say. The fire unit up above blazed away, followed a few seconds later by Friedel's assault squad running through the entanglement path and into the hostile position. Then the forward units of my detachment began to move. The sharp crack of hand grenades in our immediate vicinity drowned out the noise of firing up on the right. A few strides through smoke and haze, and we were in the hostile trench. I reached the trench at the head of my detachment. Up on the right, the trench garrison was still resisting the attack, supposedly coming from that direction. The configuration of the terrain and the dense undergrowth prevented these people from seeing that we had already smashed into their position. They did not see company after company moving at the double into the gap in their defensive system. I've said it before, but it's really fitting here. This was modern war. This was just a brief look at the beginnings of the Stormtroops.
That was an awesome quote by Erwin Rommel. Can you imagine being in a trench? Nothing really moves either direction. Like, there's huge offensives and huge casualties, but very little movement. And so you get a bombardment from one direction, you start firing where you think that's coming from, and before you know it, there are enemy troops in the trench. Like, what a crazy situation.
Other countries had their own changes in infantry doctrine, and we will talk about them later in our show. If you're curious to learn a bit more about trench raiding tactics and close quarters combat in the First World War, you can click here for our special episode, which was the first part of this mini-series. For some detailed pictures of Stormtroops, like us on Facebook or follow us on Instagram. See you next time.
Okay, so that was World War I, the Great War, German Special Forces, the Stormtroopers. That was really good. I like their stuff so much. The Indy and Spartacus and that group. But yeah, that was a really good one. The Stormtroopers, like I said, are awesome. It's kind of unfortunate that when talked about today, the Nazi SA is more what people think of, but World War I Germany's Stormtroopers were really cool. So that was a great video. Like I said, the last part of the Great Northern War series will be out later today. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I'm making a push towards 1,000, so I appreciate all the support and everything like that. I'm super grateful for it. But with all that said, I'll see you all next time.